Hello, very good morning to you. Hello, very good morning to you. And I'm very pleased to be uh, presenting this lecture on Chola Bronzes and the stylistic and metalworking aspects of Chola Bronzes. I'm Professor Sharada Srinivasan from the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore. And I'm very pleased to be invited here by the Puratattva Samvardhan Wheel of Conservation, and many thanks to Pratik Salve for this opportunity. I've been working mainly, of course, the Chola bronzes have been studied very extensively from different perspectives, the art historical and iconographic and so on, as these represent some of the most sought after and most highly appreciated artistic objects from the Indian subcontinent. But my perspective has also been that of looking at the metalworking techniques and the legacies, and in combining these various perspectives in interdisciplinary ways. How do I? Yeah, the trouble is I'm not able to move down on the slide. What do I do? Hmm. Sorry, I'm having trouble going down the slides. I just need to. How does one do that? Or is it right here? Okay. Yeah. Sorry. So I was just having some technical issues, but I've sorted that out now. Well, when we look at the objectives and historiography of archaeometallurgical studies, it is an interdisciplinary branch of the archaeological sciences concerned with the applications of scientific studies in the study of art history, archaeology, anthropology, and craft traditions, and so on, and with implications for the documentation and conservation of heritage. And of course, archaeometallurgy more specifically pertains to metallurgical heritage. And in fact, right here in this slide, you're seeing a old copper working, which is from the Agni-Gundala region in Andhra Pradesh, which I visited some 3 decades ago now. And so part of the idea is to also understand the history of mining and metallurgy and the ways in which the technology and style and the art history and archaeology and so on all interface. Now, of course, tin was typically alloyed to copper to get a harder material, which is bronze, for making weapons. And this was prior to the use of iron, that bronze was also used a lot for making implements. And so those were known as the Bronze Age cultures. And of course, the proto-historic and Harappan contexts in the Indian subcontinent were also Bronze Age cultures in that sense. And you're looking at the very celebrated Mohenjo-daro dancing girl dated to about 2500 BCE. And the reason I also put that in here is because, of course, it is a low-tin bronze with less than about 10% tin, uh, but it is also a very early example of a well-executed casting of a figurine, bronze figurine. And of course, in the Near East, by around that time, about 2500 BCE and so on, we also had a lot of use of the lost wax casting techniques, for example, also in Mesopotamia and so on. But this is a rather fine, very tiny miniature figurine, and it also has relevance to the topic that I'm talking about for various reasons, because, of course, she is described as a dancing girl, and she typically has her hand on the hip and the other hand down and the leg bent. And somehow this is a motif that seems to recur in various ways, of course, several millennia, even centuries later in the Indian subcontinent, even in more recent times in the Bharatanatyam dance tradition, which is derived from the Sadir or temple dance tradition. You do see the flexion, the bhanga, and the hand on the hip, and so on. So this stance seems to echo through generations over time in a way, although there is a big hiatus in terms of production of figurines and so on in the post-Harappan period. And you also have the interesting armful of bangles, which when I was in Dholavira, which is a Harappan site right next to, which is in the midst of this Rabari village, you see that they also wear these shell bangles on their arms, which is again echoes of these kinds of continuities. And you're also looking next to it at the photograph of the elephant from Daimabad, which is attributed to the later Harappan period, 1500 BCE, though there have been some debates about it. And that is also a solid cast image. And what is interesting when you look at it below is that it has these lugs with these holes, which look as if you could have inserted some bamboo poles into them for carrying them around for procession. And indeed, as I come to the topic of Chola bronzes, one of their main use was to be carried around in ritual procession, and they had these bamboo poles which were inserted for carrying them around. So, of course, it is a bit of a speculation, but one can't help wondering about such kinds of continuities. Coming to South India, one of the early figurines that you do find is of the so-called Mother Goddess from Adichanallur, which is in the government museum now. And it was reported also by Shivaramamurthy in his book on South Indian bronzes. And this is, of course, loosely dated to about 800 BCE or so. And it's described as the Mother Goddess. And indeed, when you look at it, it does recall to the style of the terracottas that you find from the Harappan context of mother goddesses, with the sash and the kind of very pinched kind of depiction and headgear and so on. And you also, of course, find terracottas also from the Iron Age cairns of the Nilgiris, which is in Tamil Nadu, in the bordering hills between Tamil Nadu and Karnataka and Kerala. And Breeks had reported this collection, which also has some figurines, including mother goddesses and animal figurines. And another interesting aspect is the find from a megalithic site, Kodumanal, dated to about the 3rd century BCE, which was excavated by Tamil University and Rajan, where it's a small tiger figurine which is inset with carnelian and lapis lazuli, and that again resonates to the kinds of styles of figurines that you find in some of the pottery of the Iron Age. For instance, there is a terracotta vessel with a dog finial with, on the lid from Iron Age Adichanallur, which is also in the Government Museum, Chennai. So, of course, there are not too many of these kinds of figurines, but they do occur, so it's not entirely this is just to point to some of the elements that one can look for building up to the uh, later artistic traditions. Coming to the matter of the copper ores and extraction, of course, there's a lot more of research and work and so on to be done as well in that sphere. But just to point out that, yeah, um, you're looking at this slide which shows some of the remains of copper metallurgical activity, extraction of copper from the ores from the region of Ingaldal in Karnataka. That is an old working and an open cast excavation, and you can see the greenish strains of the malachite ore and the remnants. And so around here, one also found some slag specimens. Basically, the copper ores were extracted and then smelted in highly reducing conditions to convert the ore into the pure copper metal. And typically, you find that the metal ingot would sink to the bottom of the furnace, and on top, what floats up is the slag, which contains all the impurities and the siliceous impurities. And trapped in the slags, you also have the remnants of copper metal, which we describe as sprills. And so you find these solidified droplets of molten copper. And when you study that, here just find that this is typical copper slag, and it is also from sulfidic smelting since you have a sulfide ring. And this slag heap, for instance, had a lot of pottery which was associated to the early historic Shatavahana period and so on. So it's likely that this had been exploited in antiquity by the early historic Shatavahana period around the Christian era. Well, the Brihadishwara temple, built in the 11th century, the early 11th century by the Chola Emperor Rajaraja Cholan, is a colossus which had numerous inscriptions. And the inscriptions mentioned that the Brihadishwara temple, which was dedicated to the Lord Shiva, had about 60 metal icons. And of course, of them, only two are now extant in the temple, which you're looking at in this picture. One is of Ardavalan, or Nataraja, as the dancer, who was the Kula Devata, or the family deity of the Cholas. And this was cast as a processional image, or the Utsava Murti, or the festival icons. And he's also seen here with his consort, Shivakami or Parvati. And of course, this is thrown open to the public during special festivals such as at Dashara and so on. And as you can see, there is a lot of offerings which are still made. The Naivedyam is done with bananas and coconuts and floral offerings and so on. So these are still in worship. And the Chola inscriptions also describe the South Indian bronzes as Cheppu Terumini, or the copper images, according to Nagaswami and others. And the inscriptions also mention that the royal patrons and the queens also made donations of lamps, as well as the temple dancers in attendance. And there were about 400 of the temple dancers who were attached to the temple. So there is a living tradition and legacy and so on, which carries on not only in the bronze casting, but also in the dance traditions and so on. Well, amongst the celebrated masterpieces of Chola bronzes, I'll draw attention to two, one of which is the Shiva as Vrishabhavahana, or the pastoral form of Shiva with consort Parvati, which is in the Tanjavur Art Gallery. And here you can very clearly see the holes for carrying it around in procession as the Utsavamurti, and it would have, of course, been all decorated with flowers and clad in silk and so on, as you saw. And here you see Shiva as Rishabhavahana, the one with the bull. The bull is missing here, and he's with the consort Shivakami. And there is also inscriptions in the Shvetaranyeshwara temple in Tiruvangadu, which suggest the dedication of such a set of Rishabhavahana and the consort. And this was also found in the precincts of the Tiruvangadu temple. And these inscriptions were mentioned the donation of such images in 1011 and 1012 AD, which is in the period of Rajarajan. So we could attribute it to this period. And it's also interesting when you look at this very beautiful Chola image of Ardhanarishwara, which is also from Tiruvangadu, which is now in the Government Museum, Chennai. And this icon represents Parvati conjoined with Shiva, representing the unity between the male and female principles of Purusha and Prakriti. And this is also from Thiruvangadu, and it could probably be from similar ateliers. In a way, it's almost as if when you combine, the Rishabhavahana that you see along with Shivakami, the one half of that and the of the male half and the female half, then you get something akin to this Ardhanarishwara. And I also put this in to point out that Ardhanarishwara is also depicted with the bull or Nandi, as you see in the stone sculpture in the Chola period. Well, the amongst the renowned patrons, I mentioned Rajaraja Chola, but another very remarkable patroness of Chola sculpture and bronzes and so on was the 10th century Chola queen, Sembian Mahadevi. And under her, the Nataraja bronze also seems to come more prominently into the sculptural tradition, as you see in the Malaya Temple, which was built by her in the earlier half of the 10th century. And you're also looking in this slide at a beautiful bronze, which is of of a Devi image, which is now in the Freer Gallery of Art. And it has been speculated that this could represent the widowed queen, Sembian Mahadevi, by art historians such as Vidya Deheja. And she's also depicted here wearing the punal or the sacred thread, which also points to the status which was accorded to the feminine form in the Chola period, which is associated with learning and so on. And interestingly, this queen was also greatly revered. There is a town, Sembian Mahadevi, which is named after her, and according to inscription, deified images of her were taken around in procession on her natal star. And an inscription of Rajendra I mentions the offerings for worship to be made to images of Sembian Mahadevi. And there are also other interesting inscriptions, such as at the Sadhutarai temple, one of which also makes reference to the community of bronze workers or the Kamala. And I also put in a set of the processional bronzes in this temple, which has again a Nataraja and Shivakami image. And here the Nataraja image is quite beautiful, very simply decorated as an ascetic with the Rudraksha and so on, and the tiger skin, and also points to that ascetic quality of Nataraja. And in fact, that set that you see with the Prabhavali around it, it also reminds one of the representation that you still see, the painted representations that you see, for instance, in Chidambaram, the 12th century ceiling painting of Nataraja and Shivakami, where the Prabhas are made in a similar fashion. Well, of course, the Nataraja image is the most celebrated and well known of Indian artistic accomplishments. And you're looking here at a bronze from the Kankodu Vanithavam provenance in the Government Museum, Chennai, of the 11th century. And so some of my work had been to do with the analysis of bronzes, and this image typically had 8% tin and 8% lead, which I had analyzed by inductively coupled plasma optical emission analysis. And in a way, it's very remarkable that in an era preceding the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, of which you have great masters such as Leonardo da Vinci, who made this a very well known representation of the Vitruvius man, which is represented within the anthropomorphic form within the circle. Already in the 10th century, in the Chola period, you have this rather beautiful three-dimensional representation of the human form within the circle. And here it is what is described as the Satkona, which is two triangles which are superposed to form a six-sided star. And this particular image from Kankodu Vanithavam really brings out this inherent geometry very beautifully. Well, Ananda Kumaraswamy, the renowned geologist turned art historian of Sri Lankan Tamil descent, wrote in the 1920s in The Dance of Shiva from Shaiva Siddhanta texts that Shiva's dance represents the five activities, the Panchakritya, Srishti or creation, which is represented by the drum, Sthiti or preservation, Samhara or destruction, which is represented by the fire, Tirobhava, illusion, Anugraha, and which is salvation. And he also writes that the Unmai Vilakam tells us that creation arises from the drum, protection proceeds from the hand of hope, from the fire proceeds destruction, the foot held aloft gives release. This is poetry, but nonetheless science. And the writings of Kumaraswamy also inspired many artistic responses, and it's also thought that perhaps T.S. Eliot, the celebrated poet, when he wrote Burnt Norton, had something of this in mind when he wrote that at the still point of the turning world, there the dance is, neither arrest nor movement. And of course, what is also remarkable about the Chola bronze form is that it also balances the needs, the technical requirements of bronze casting. And so you see the flying sashes and so on, which I'll explain also, and the hands, the way it is attached to the Prabhavali. That is all to make the metal flow better and to provide greater stability also to the icon. And in fact, next to it, I've put the stone image of Nataraja in the Gangaikonda Chorapuram temple, which is the new capital founded by Rajendra Chola around 1025 CE. And there you see that the lifted leg of Nataraja is actually propped up on a stone strut, because stone does not have very good tensile strength, and they could have been it might have actually broken if the strut hadn't been placed and so on. So there was some understanding of also the property and the manipulation of materials in all of this. Well, the process of lost wax casting of metal icons is an age-old one, and this is the workshop of Radha Krishna Sthapati, Shri Radha Krishna Sthapati of Swami Malay in Tanjavur district. And typically, the icons were made by the lost wax casting process, which is also mentioned in the Shilpat Shastras, such as the Manasollasa, and it is described as Madhu Chehiste Vidhana, which is basically translated as the lost wax casting process. And to describe what happens there, first, the wax model of the icon to be cast is made using the various proportionate systems, and then it is covered by numerous layers of wax to form the mold. And then the mold is heated so that the wax is melted out, and then the molten metal is poured into the cavity which is formed in the mold, so that when it solidifies, it takes the shape of the image to be cast. And in fact, the word in Tamil for the mold is also karu, which is also the same term which is used to describe the womb. So there is a sense of the birthing process, the icon, in fact, giving it life from the material to the immanent or non-material in a way. And this idea also of the birthing is described also in the Charaka Samhita as well, of, the sense of giving birth to the icon. And the casting technologies and technical investigations on the bronzes also throw light on the history of technology. And you can see here also that because metal does not flow terribly well, you need to add these wax channels, which are called runners. And here in the middle, you see a slide of the wax model, which has these wax channels which have been added to distribute the metal. And in fact, they are retained in the casting, and then finally they have to be cut off and broken off. And so sometimes you see that they are still prevalent in the unfinished bronzes and such like. And at the bottom, what you're looking at is a microstructure. Typically, a microstructure refers to a small specimen or of the actual icon, which is metallographically polished, which is first mounted in resin and so on, and then metallographically polished. And in this case, one had also attempted actually a technique called in situ metallography, where you just do it by examining on and doing that, on the pedestal right on the surface. And what you see is that unfinished Vishnu, which is actually in the Prince of Wales, what was then the Prince of Wales Museum and now called the CSVMS Museum. So you can see that that is actually a brass image, alpha brass. And that the blackish material that you see is actually the mold impregnation into the microstructure. In this case, that is a flawed casting, but that just gives a sense of what the microstructural studies can tell us. And next to it is another microstructure from a 13th century Chola piece, which uh, tells you that it is a leaded bronze, as cast leaded bronze, because you see the dendritic structure of the uh, copper alloy matrix. And it has it's a low leaded tin bronze, and the lead tends to segregate along the grain boundaries and so on. So you can tell a lot about the way it was made just by looking at the microstructure. And what I had managed to do was to undertake the compositional analysis of several representative bronzes of the uh, Chola period, not just Chola, but also South Indian bronzes of different periods from uh, Chola, Pallava, Vijayanagara, and so on. And the idea was then to look at the representative bronzes so that one can, understand the compositional uh, aspects of bronzes of different styles. And some 18 elements were analyzed, which included the major elements, the minor elements, and the trace elements. So typically, the major elements are those which are intentionally alloyed. In this case, when you're making bronze or brass, then you add lead or tin to copper if it's bronze, and if it's brass, then you add zinc and lead to the copper to get brass, and so on. And there are also, of course, the trace elements which are, found along with the copper source and so on. And one thing I should mention here that although these icons are often described as Panchaloha icons, in actual fact, this term Panchaloha is more symbolic than literal because these are basically leaded bronzes or leaded brasses. And even today, the Sthapati will tell you that the Panchaloha is just that, in addition to the major alloys, which as I've mentioned, it has to be leaded bronze or leaded brass, they would also just add, maybe if the client wanted, more as a symbolic gesture, more for Shastra, they would have added some very, very minor traces of gold and silver. But anyway, as minor as those traces were, and given that these were large icons, you actually don't find gold or silver showing up in the analysis above traces in any of the analysis I have done. These are all leaded bronzes and leaded brasses. And there are some differences in the alloys used over different periods. For instance, the Chola period seems to show, the most amount of tin. There's an average of about 6 to 7% tin and 7% lead. And some, of course, images also have tin going up to about 15%, but they never cross the alpha solid solution. And then you also see that there are more of brasses being used in different periods and such like. I just want to now also move on to another technique which I used a lot in the study of bronzes, which is known as lead isotope analysis. Now, typically, what happens with metal artifacts is, these questions do come up as to how do we date objects and how do we also authenticate them and so on. Because, of course, bronzes were being made over so many different periods. So it was a long-standing continuing tradition. And in this case, as you may have seen from the slides, that these were solid cast images, which is that they were made of solid metal. So, I mean, there is no absolute method of dating metallic artifacts in that way, the way we have for organic materials which have charcoal. You can do some carbon dating and so on. But at least for bronzes, uh, it's not that easy to find those kinds of remnants for dating. And so the technique that I'd used to actually understand the internal classification of objects over different periods was what we call lead isotope fingerprinting or lead isotope ratio analysis. Now, lead isotope ratio analysis can be quite useful because Isotopic ratios of lead can vary discretely depending on the source of lead. And those factors whereby they vary across different sources of lead is also related to the um, geochemistry of the ore deposits and so on. So basically, what it means is that different sources of lead can have different isotopic ratios. And these isotopic ratios are retained in the artifacts which have lead, which is alloyed from those sources. And so, what can tend to happen is that artifacts which are made with lead from particular sources can tend to cluster together, or even if they have been similarly processed in some ways. So there is some meaning that we can find in the clustering of objects with lead isotope ratios. And in this case, of course, there's a lot more to all this, but I don't want to go on to all that because it would become too technical. But in this case, broadly speaking, what one did find was that the lead isotope ratios of the uh, Chola bronzes, which we attribute to the 11th to the 10th to 11th centuries and so on, were certainly distinct from, for example, the lead isotope ratios that we attribute to the later Vijayanagara period, sometime between 1336 to 1526 CE. And of course, the Vijayanagara dynasty, the Chola dynasty had its capital in Tanjavur, but the Vijayanagara dynasty that we're talking about, uh, of course, had its capital in Hampi, but several of the Nayaka rulers were also ruling in Tamil Nadu, and several bronzes also continued to be made in Tanjore in different periods. So we do find that there are these different clusters of isotopic ratios, which of course we need to do more studies to actually identify the ore sources and or also to understand, uh, you know, uh, to identify the ore sources, as I said, but there are also other aspects to be understood there as to whether this is, in what way the metal processing and all that was different. But anyway, to sum it up, it does give some way of actually telling apart bronzes of different periods, which proved to be quite useful to tell apart the stylistic aspects of some of the bronzes. And of course, as I had also mentioned, I had already done, this was part of my doctoral thesis work also at the Institute of Archaeology in London, where I had done inductively coupled plasma optical emission spectroscopy for about 150 bronzes and so on. And what was also found is, as I had mentioned, the alloying of copper and tin and lead and so on would be, the major elements would be slightly more at random. So you may not necessarily be able to find very clear trends which are characteristic based on those. But what was found, because for instance, there are some early brasses also, although a lot of the earlier pieces from the Chola period were more of bronze than brass, and you see more of brass maybe being used later, but you do find some earlier brasses as well. So there's no hard and fast rule in that sense. But what I did find is that the elements which we describe as chalcophilic, or rather the elements which tend to segregate with the copper, those elements, in this case, nickel, cobalt, arsenic, antimony, um, uh, and bismuth, these tended to cluster together in some meaningful way for the different groups of bronzes, such as Chola and Vijayanagara and even Pallava and so on, which could be actually related to the source of copper and so on. And perhaps there were discrete sources being used in the different periods, which resulted in this kind of clustering. Anyway, what is meaningful is then I could use these trends to try and look again at the stylistic dating and so on of the bronzes to tell apart bronzes of later periods from earlier periods and so on. And this image that you're looking at, for example, is a typical Chola piece, Senian Vidudi Kali, which is dated from paleographic inscription to the 10th century. And this had the trace element and data ratio trends and all that fitting the Chola period in that sense. So I try to, as much as possible, use inscribed material or inscribed bronzes and also seals and other inscribed material to validate this sort of calibration. And I just wanted to point to some highlights over here. Now, in this slide, you're looking at one image, which is, I don't know if you're able to Yes, it says a Shivakami from Karaiviram in Tanjavur district. Now that actually is one of the dated images. It has a pedestal description of 917 CE, and it is attributed to Parantaka Choran, and Nagaswamy has published that. Of course, I couldn't analyze that particular image, but I just wanted to point out that a couple of the images that I analyzed, such as the Somaskanda Nidur Parvati, which is in the Government Museum, which has about 12% tin, is it in bronze, that had very typical trends which matched the Chola period fingerprints. And there are some stylistic similarities also there with this Karaiviram Parvati. So, that fits the attribution of the early Chola period. And another piece which fitted this Chola trend is this sampled Parvati from Tiruvangimalai, which is also in the Government Museum, Chennai, which also looks like a typical Chola piece. And in the bottom of the slide, you're seeing a image of Rama, which is from which is in the Victor and Albert Museum now, and the fingerprints for that actually very clearly fitted the Vijayanagara era, the ellipse and the fingerprints for the Vijayanagara period. And it is a brass image, in fact, with 21% zinc. And here you see that the Rama image is also holding the bow. So it is what we would describe as a Kodanda Rama depiction. And in fact, the Ramachandra temple in Hampi, which is attributed to Devaraya in 15th century, also has a prominent depiction of Kodandarama with the bow. And as I said, this image typically fitted the Vijayanagara set of bronzes. And as you can see, it's quite distinct and different also stylistically from the Chola pieces. So there is some validation both from the art history and from the technical analysis of this attribution and so on. And another couple of images that you're looking at the bottom are also images of Rama. Now, one of them on the side is a 13th century Rama from uh, Thiruvelangadu, which is in the Government Museum, Chennai. Now, this was fingerprinted to the later Chola period. And next to it, you see another image, which is also of a Rama from which is in the Victor and Albert Museum, which had been fingerprinted to the Vijayanagara era. And so again, you see it is able to also technically tell apart these bronzes and attribute them in ways which are also consistent with the stylistic attribution. But I also wanted to draw attention to the iconometry of these images. As mentioned, of course, the traditional modeling uses the Talamana canon, whereby the proportions of the figures are divided into various talas and so on. And what was interesting is that the Rama of the 13th century has follows the tala system, which is closer to the Ashtatala, which one would attribute more to an idealized image, idealized man. And so he's, of course, in this case, Rama is also the prince. So he's an idealized man in that respect, or the idealized king. But in the Rama figure from the Vijayanagara era, there's much more elongation. And here he actually follows the Dashatala system. And Dashatala is much more closely associated with the major deities such as Vishnu, and of course Rama being also an avatar of Vishnu. So in this case, there almost seems to be an enhancement in the cultic status of the Rama image to that of a major deity. And in fact, it is really in the Vijayanagara period that you have the prominent worship with separate temples for Rama, such as the Ramachandra temple. Whereas in the Chola period, of course, a lot of the temples were Shaivite, but also you don't see such prominent individual temples and so on in the earlier period as you do. So that is one of these interesting nuances, I suppose. So I was mentioning, of course, the prospect of the different discrete metal sources in the Vijayanagara period from the Chola period. And one had, of course, tried to also explore that a bit more. And you're looking here also at one of the temples in the Hampi region, which I put that in because it also very beautifully demonstrates how the landscape, the boulders and so on are so much a part of the spectacular nature of this cultural landscape. And this is the Malaya Raghunatha temple, which just sort of blends into this landscape of porphyritic granite. And further north in towards Tintini, which is slightly north of Hampi, there is actually a copper ore deposit which I had visited, and somewhere up on the hill also you find these wash tanks for washing of the copper ore and so on. And there is also the temple associated to with a saint known as Moneshwara, who is associated with metalworking. And so I had undertaken some of the analysis of the slags collected from this area. And so you're looking also at a microstructure of a photomicrograph of the copper slag from Tintini, which very clearly shows these remnants of copper. It's a very lean slag, which means a very efficient smelting process had been used. And what I did find was quite interesting is that the nickel cobalt ratios that I found in the copper in the slag uh, actually corresponded to the nickel cobalt ratios found in those Vijayanagara bronzes. So it's possible that that clustering could be related to the source of metal in this case, which could be Tintini and so on. So of course it is a bit of a preliminary study, but still there are these interesting pointers that we find. And another interesting aspect from the study also pertains to some of the Buddhist images that I had studied and also the Vishnu images. Now, I was talking about the solid casting and hollow casting process, and I've also put in here a radiograph of this Vishnu image, a solid cast Vishnu image, which you see in black and white, which is of the Pallava period. And that radiograph shows you that it is very well made in a solid casting process because it is a solid metal that you see from the radiograph. Now, interestingly, this solid cast Vishnu was also fingerprinted from the analysis to the Pallava period. It followed the technical trends for the Pallava period. And if you see also, it has certain characteristics that you associate with Pallava sculptures, such as you see in the Dharmaraja Ratha in Mahabalipuram, very typically the looped sashes and the slanted way of holding the chakra of Vishnu and so on. So this is also interesting because actually not many inscribed Pallava bronzes had come to date, so it had not really been very well appreciated, uh, about the prevalence of the Pallava school of bronzes. But these finds also serve to verify or ratify this notion that there was already by the Pallava period quite a well-developed school of bronze casting and so on. And just to compare between the hollow casting and solid casting method, when I showed you the slides earlier, I was showing you what we describe as the solid casting method, where the entire image is made of solid wax. But there was another method of casting which actually goes back to Hellenistic antecedents, and that was quite widely used in the Greco-Roman world, where basically to reduce the amount of metal that was used, they had shifted to using a clay core, which was made of a clay material, and then on top of that a thin layer of wax was added, so that when you finally covered the mold and you melted out the wax and poured in the metal, the casting would actually comprise of a thin layer of metal. And what you're seeing in that slide just to the top in the corner is actually a hollow cast image of Avalokiteshvara, which is from the Krishna Delta, and it is in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And that is actually found in the Krishna Delta and hence was attributed to the early Andhra Pallava period. And I don't have time to go into it, but the fingerprinting that was done also was consistent with such an early Andhra Pallava attribution. And there was another image of artifact from the Krishna Delta, which also fitted the lead isotope ratios for that artifact and so on. And since I was also mentioning the hollow casting and solid casting technique, the other image that we're looking at here in the middle is a beautiful gilded image of Buddha from Nagapattinam. And this is now the Victor and Albert Museum. It's about 1 meter high. And from the analysis that I had done, the lead isotope fingerprinting and the trace element fingerprinting. This fitted what I would describe as the late Chola period, which of course for more clarity I've called it the Chalukya Chola period, because by then there was also a Eastern Chalukyan prince who had come to the Chola throne. But anyway, it is a late Chola piece, which is of about 11th to 12th century. And it's interesting in this image, it is a solid image, and it also has these processional holes at the bottom, which suggests that even though it's a Buddha image, it was also probably taken around in procession, which more closely follows the tradition that you had in southern India for Hindu images as Utsava Murtis or processional icons. So that is an interesting example of syncretism. And if you look at the robes, the way they fall, and the position of the hands and so on, it also seems to draw from the celebrated Sultanganj Buddha, which is the largest known life-size bronze image, which is now in the Birmingham Museum. It's a very spectacular image, and I particularly put that photograph in with me standing next to it so that you can see the scale of it. And that is attributed to about the 7th century, the late Gupta period. And so stylistically, it is similar to this image. But I have to say that the Sultanganj Buddha is also a holocaust image. And in that sense, it is actually follows the Hellenistic trend of using holocasting, which goes back to the Gandharan influence and so on in northwestern India, where the holocasting process comes in for the making of statuary bronzes. Now, I'll also talk about another rather interesting finding from my study, which was to do with the trying to understand the evolution of the trajectory of the Nataraja bronze, and I've published quite a few pieces on this going back to Marg in 2001 and World Archaeology in 2004 and so on. And one of the interesting findings was that although the Nataraja bronze, in which the image of Shiva dancing is represented with the leg lifted in what we described as a Bhujanga Trasita Karana, or the serpent fright posture, so to speak. And although that image has been very closely identified with the Chola period and seen as having emerged in the Chola period, what my studies actually suggested was that the images of Nataraja in that particular posture might have already been formulated within the Pallava period already. And in this slide, for example, you're looking in the center at a Nataraja in the British Museum. And as you see, the leg is lifted here in the Bhujanga Trasita Karna. And this fitted the lead isotope trends and so on for the Pallava period, not the Chola period. So that means that this is loosely, prior to the late 9th century, 6 to maybe 650 to 850 or 875 AD. And and next to it is another piece which is from Kuram, and this piece has also been argued by another art historian, Nagaswamy, to belong to the Pallava period. And in this case, the Nataraja image is shown dancing in the Urdhva Janu posture with the leg lifted in that particular posture. And this image from Kuram is also found along with certain copper plates of the Pallava period. So there is a good reason for giving that a Pallava attribution. And I had also analyzed it, and it fitted the Pallava technical fingerprints. And if you see these images, what they have in common is that I had also pointed it out earlier, this looped sashes, the Kati Sutra, as we describe it, very prominent Kati Sutra. And both of them also have the forward-facing dwarf Apasmara, who is below the dancing foot, and he's holding a snake, and rather similar depictions. And next to it, I've put in this slide of a Pallava stone sculpture from the Kailasa Swami temple in Kanchipuram. And of course, that is a very typical Pallava example. And again, you see this use of the looped sashes, the Kati Sutra, which is a very typical Pallava feature. So one could conclude that this image of Nataraja is also a Pallava Nataraja. And another reason for uh, suggesting that this Bhujangatrasta Karna was already in vogue in the Pallava period. It comes from a 7th century uh, pilaster representation from Siyamangalam. And you see there that this is a frieze in which Shiva is dancing in the Bhujangatrasatakarna, sorry, with the leg extended. And just below his foot is, in fact, a depiction of the serpent. So you can see the sense of the serpent fright being evoked. And next to it is a figure who is playing this horizontal drum. And in his hand, he's holding this fire, the Agni, you know, and of course, in this case, one hand is in Gajahasta and the other is in, of course, Abhay Mudra. So it's not crossed over, but in many other ways, and there's no Apasmara also here, but in many other ways, the depiction is already evolved here of what we would associate with the dancing Shiva and Bhujangatrasta Karna associated with the Nataraja bronze. And at the bottom, I've also put in the slide from Badami, the 6th century Chalukyan representation of Natesha. And here you see, so this was really the kind of depiction which was more widely seen in other parts of India, the Natesha, where Shiva is dancing in Chatura Tandava. And in this case, of course, he's also dancing with 8 arms. So it's a very dynamical and beautiful and large stone sculpture. And there's Ganesha next to him. And you also see the figure of somebody with, next to the drum. And of course, there is also, you know, the aspect that the Pallavas had occupied Badami for about a decade, around 654 CE. So it could have been some of the influences that they carried over from the Chalukyan region. And then, of course, set about also bringing out these various other depictions and so on. And now, what I also wanted to mention was that it's also interesting that when we attribute the Nataraja image dancing in Bhujangatrasta Karna to the Pallava period, that also has various other implications, such as when we look at the devotional poetry. Because by the 9th century, of course, you have between the 6th to 9th centuries, a lot of the poets of the devotional saints were coming into, into vogue, and they also influenced this whole emergence of the cult of the worship of Nataraja, and also probably inspired the artisans and sculptors and so on. And for example, you have a very beautiful verses of the Saint Manikavachakar in the 9th century, which already points to some kind of mystical comprehension of the Nataraja icon. Of course, at this time it was uh, he's mainly referred to as Kutan or Adavalan, and that term Nataraja is actually not found until much later. But there is a beautiful verse of Manika Vachikar in Tamil which goes, "Let us praise the dancer Kutan who sports, creating, destroying this heaven and earth and all else." So this sense of nascent sense of creation and destruction, although as I mentioned with Kumaraswami's 13th century verses, he writes about that much more in that context. It's more pronounced perhaps in some of those later texts, but already there seems to be some nascent idea of this aspect. And I come back to this image which I had shown earlier from Kankodu Vanitavam, which had been fingerprinted to uh, the High Chola period. And now it is also interesting to point out that Chidambaram is also the only shrine which had a very interesting tradition of worship of Nataraja in the main sanctum, whereas in all other temples it is the lingam, the aniconic lingam, which is worshipped in the main sanctum, and the Nataraja icon is really the processional image. But here at Chidambaram, Nataraja is also worshipped as the Akasalingam, or the formless ether. And of course, the old name of Chidambaram was Thillai, and later this term Chidambaram, it also, there are various readings of it, Sittambalam, which is the golden hall. But Chidambaram also, of course, evokes a sense of the Chit, which is mind, and the Ambaram, which is the cladding, in this case, the cosmos. So this connection between the mind and the cosmos and so on. And you find that much more perhaps in the later texts which are associated with the worship practices of this temple, which comes more into prominence after the 12th century. And at the bottom, you also see this ceiling panel painting of Nataraja. Now, one of the interesting findings also from the technical fingerprinting was that this particular Nataraja that you're looking at from Mela Perambalam, which shows, of course, Nataraja, in the typical dance posture, Bhujanga Trasta Karana. There's one difference in which that the hair or the locks of the Nataraja are actually falling down. They are not flying as you see in the top description. In the Nataraja from Kankodu Vanitavam, I guess that is what we may describe as the Ananda Tandavam, which is the dance of furious bliss in a way. And the Ananda Tandavam is what is associated mainly with the dance of Shiva in the South Indian worship traditions. But in the bottom, you see that the locks are actually falling down. And according to the tradition of the Dikshitars, the family of Raja Dikshitar and Kandan Dikshitar, and what they also conveyed to the scholar Lisbeth Pankajan, which here also presented, there is also the tradition of the Shanti Kuta in Chidambaram, which is actually the end of the Anantandavan. So the hair falling down is actually the end of that dance. And it's interesting that this particular Nataraja from Mela Perambalam actually has the hair more sort of falling down rather than flying like that in the more in that dramatic depiction. And of course, at the bottom, you also see the ganas holding cymbals, the accompanists to the dance. And so this could actually be related to this later tradition. And what was also interesting is actually the Government Museum Chennai had labeled it as an earlier 10th century piece. But from the lead isotope analysis and the compositional analysis, that pointed to a later date of the later Chola period around the 12th century. And in fact, that the depiction also fits better with the time when this worship at Chidambaram actually comes into prominence, the 12th century. So that idea that this actually represents, it is a slightly later bronze and represents the Shanti Kuta. Kuta is also quite interesting. And the painting that I showed you on the side from the ceiling also has the Jare falling down in this way that one would describe more with the Shanti Kutu. Well, one other interesting aspect which I tried to explore with the study was to do with this idea, as I'd already mentioned, the verse from Manikavachakar, but trying to understand, because of course through the writings of Kumaraswamy, this image has really come to have a life of its own, being described as the cosmic dance of Shiva and so on. So at that time, some years ago, I had undertaken a collaboration with the late astrophysicist Dr. Nirupama Raghavan, and we were trying to understand whether there was actually any connection with an appreciation of the cosmos or observation of, the celestial phenomena or something in the actual depiction of the bronze. And so, in that light, we had also been following, for instance, some of the writings of, there is the work of Ganapati Stapati, the master stone sculptor from Mahabalipuram in Tamil Nadu. And he had in his work uh, on bronze casting in the 80s, he had mentioned that the Nataraja icon must be visualized within the 6 white stars that surround the red star, Thiruvadurai. And Thiruvadurai is actually Alpha Orionis, or and Alpha Orionis, or Betelgeuse as it's known, is also associated as the star which is associated with Shiva Nataraja. And of course, it's also interesting that there is a festival in the month of December, the Margari Thiruvadurai, where the constellation of Orion actually appears right ahead, overhead, in the zenith of Chidambaram. And that is also described as Arudra Darshanam. So Arudra Darshanam is the observance related to Arudra, which is, as mentioning, is the star Betelgeuse. And there is also an illustration which the late Raja Dikshitar had shown me in this book by Chokolingam of the 1940s, which is described as Arudra Tandava Darshanam, where you have the a drawing of the Nataraja image on the top, and below it the star positions of the Orion constellation and those around it. So you get the sense that they were actually trying to perhaps visualize a Nataraja image within the parameters of the Orion constellation. So Dr. Nirupama Raghavan and I had gone into this a bit more, and we had undertaken a star chart plotting of Orion, in this case of the around 800 CE, on top of this image, which we had, which I had technically fingerprinted to belonging to the Pallava period, and it shows here that the star positions in a way coincide with the bodily positions. The belt of Orion coinciding with the belt or the waist of Shiva Nataraja, and Betelgeuse falling on the shoulder of Nataraja and so on. And what was also interesting is that the lifted leg was tending to, point towards the star Sirius. And Sirius is also known as Mrigavyada in the Sanskrit tradition and so on, going back to, which was also having a lot of significance going back to Vedic times. And it's also related to um, Shiva, to Shiva as well. So there could have been some significance there in terms of this particular depiction of Shiva dancing with the lifted leg, which you only really see in Tamil Nadu and you don't see it in other parts of India. And so whether this kind of correlation with the star positions had some significance is certainly something to be kept in mind. Of course, it needs further work to really underscore it a bit more. And it's also very evocative that there is a verse by Appar in the 7th century, which has been translated by Handelman and Schulman, which goes, "The Lord of the little chamber filled with honey will fill me with sky, nilavu, and make me be." And here he uses the Tamil word nilavu rather than the word akasha, which we come to correlate with the ether or the cosmos and so on, the Sanskrit word, which comes into use more later. But this word nilavu and the sense of filling with sky already seems to be there in terms of the understanding of, the dancing lord at Tillai and so on. And there's another very beautiful verse by Manika Vachakar, which gives you a sense of the significance of this lifted foot, which, as I said, of course, the fact that it points to Sirius could be one aspect, but just the fact of the lifted foot having such an evocative sense, it's described as a tender flower. And he sings here, "He revealed his foot, which is like a tender flower, entered my agam, innermost part, and caused me to dance." And here the use of the word agam is also very interesting, because there's a whole genre of poetics which goes back to the Tamil Sangam period of the pre-Christian or early Christian era, where agam is the inner space which deals with love poetry and so on. And Puram is the exterior space, which is more of the bardic poetry about the rulers and kings and so on. So here he talks about entering my agam, which is the inner space, and causing him to dance. So that's very quite moving, even for some of us who have been involved with the dance tradition going back to all of these poetics, that this sense that even the Shaiva Siddhantic devotees were probably themselves moved to dance by this vision of Nataraja. So it's a very profound linking in a way between the inner space and the outer space, and through this very beautiful medium of dance and celebrating dance in a way. Um, so I put this slide in here just to point out that I have a lot of publications going back to 1999, from the fingerprinting to also looking at various aspects of the dating of the Nataraja and so on. And then recently, of course, these are more popular writings. Perhaps a couple of articles were compiled in this small volume which had been brought out by GNCA. Two of my articles on the Nataraja and cosmic space and so on. And that compilation also included Ananda Kumara Swami's celebrated Dance of Shiva, which is, of course, a great honor for me. And there's another article which I've gone in more in the techniques of bronze casting and the living traditions which were used even today by the Sthapatis and the technical aspects related to bronze casting. But of course, I haven't actually included any of the analytical aspects. Those have gone in more into the technical journals, such as Journal of Metals and Archaeometry. And anyway, I'm still working on that book, which brings together all of these aspects. And finally, I thought I would come back to this more as an artist, because I'd like to now separate the archaeologist and the scientist, and now get into more of an exploration as an artist. And I make that point here as an artist because there's been a lot, of course, of interest in the Nataraja image because of the appeal to the scientific imagination, as it were. And I'm not going to say that, I'm not one of those that will readily say that there is all this ancient science and so on to be looked for in, pre-modern societies, wherever it is across the world, because modern science has a very different rigor and experimental approach. The two don't really gel. But what I'd like to say is, of course, that it's nice to take inspiration, which I think of as artistic inspiration also, which has contemporary relevance. And so, in that sense, I would like to just touch upon the contemporary artistic and philosophical responses to the Nataraja icon from scientists and artists, in the present day or in the recent times. And you're looking here, of course, at celebrated 11th century Nataraja image from Thiruvelangadu, the Government Museum, Chennai. And this image was the one that was really celebrated by Ananda Kumaraswamy and also then by Rodin in the early 20th century. And they also used that particular image in many of their writings. And so these writings also inspired a lot of scientists and writers. And there was Fritjof Capra. Of course, he wasn't, though he had a background in quantum physics and quantum mechanics, he didn't really go on to publish in a way as to become a very distinguished or well-known scientist. But certainly his writings, and in a more poetic and artistic vein, have attracted a lot of interest. And he did a rather interesting superposition of a bubble chamber map on a Nataraja bronze. Of course, I would again see this as an artwork, really, rather than a point to do with, it's not necessarily about scientific validation, but as an artistic work, he used the same bronze and plotted a bubble chamber map on it. And of course, he wrote in a rather evocative way that for modern physicists, Shiva's dance is the dance of subatomic matter. As in Hindu mythology, it's a continuous dance of creation and destruction involving the whole cosmos, and so on. And the bubble chamber photographs of interacting particles bear testimony to the rhythm of creation and destruction and such like. And these writings then also inspired other artists in other ways, which I'll come to, but also there was an installation that was presented by the government of India. I think this was now in 2004. I forget the exact date, but around those times. And late Dr. Baldev Raj, who was also for a brief while director at NIAS, had also been involved with IGCAR with the approaching CERN to make this presentation. So this is actually one of the largest Nataraja images carved by in one of the master sculptors in Swami Malay. And the plaques were also added to that installation with the writings of Kumaraswamy and Capra and so on. So it's to point to the contemporary, the fact that these ideas and artistic notions can also enrich our lives in the present day, regardless of the other aspects of the cultural and religious and so on baggage and so on, because these become artworks which speak to us in their own right. And of course, this idea of the cosmic dance also inspired the celebrated astronomer Carl Sagan, who also mentioned that he would like to see in these the premonition, in a way, of modern astronomical ideas, simply because I think when you look at it in the pre-modern context, most of the cultures had, as Sagan himself says, maybe whether it's a Judaic, Christian, or others, they had a slightly more limiting view of a cosmic perception, whereas this idea of creation and destruction and long time spans is something which seems to have been uh, more readily prevalent or intuitively, anticipated in some of the the writings of in the Hindu philosophical traditions and so on are associated with those kinds of thinking. And here he also writes very beautifully that of the Nataraja image, in the upper right hand is a drum whose sound is the sound of creation. In the upper left is a tongue of flame, a reminder that the universe now newly created will billions of years from now be utterly destroyed. And of course, it also brings a sense of humility, especially coming from such a great astronomer, that really we are just specks in this these long time spans, you know, and it makes us give pause and think about, you know, makes us more introspective in a way. And of course, I had just put this in with, there's also a rather beautiful painting by a Belge artist, Chola, which I had put in here. And speaking of other kinds of inspiration, this is also a very interesting aspect of an inspiration of the Nataraja image in terms of contemporary art, uh, you know, bringing together elements of space, dance, and design. And so I'd also put this in an exhibition that I had put together, a photo montage in a, you know, exhibition, which is a more you know, impressionistic sort of exhibition, which had put together various ideas related to this theme of cosmic dance of Shiva in a more impressionistic sort of way. And here you have of course, you see that image of Nataraja with the beautiful locks, the floating locks, which, you know, it's very uncanny how, you know, so many centuries earlier, it seems to metaphorically capture some sense of weightlessness of space. And in fact, the sculptor Arthur Woods was very inspired by the writings of Fritjof Capra, and he actually went on to create a certain uh, sculpture which he called the Cosmic Dancer sculpture, and that was inspired, of course, by Capra's writings on the Nataraja bronze. And by taking advantage of the microgravity environment in the low Earth orbit, this sculpture, the Cosmic Dancer, which weighed about 1 kg and was constructed of hollow aluminum tubing and so on, was actually introduced on board the Mir space station in 1993, and it became part of their living space. And Arthur Woods, who's a Swiss sculptor, also mentioned that he was inspired by the description of the universe found in both modern physics and Eastern religions, the cosmos being made up of a dynamic flow of energy and matter and such like. And of course, then this sculpture did go down with the Mir space station, but it's still, it's, you know, there's also a beautiful video that he had on his website of it moving through space in this very hypnotic and uniform motion and so on. So it's a rather lovely coming together of ancient and modern ideas of art, and I think that's what uh, in the end gives relevance, is bringing together, you know, the contemporary relevance, and the way we can enrich our lives in the present day is always a very motivating factor. And I think, yes, so I come with that to the end of my presentation. And as I mentioned, some of these had also been put together in this photo montage, which I had put up with the Alliance Française in various sites. And of course, I'm grateful to many prominent scholars along the journey, and there are too many to list, but the Government Museum Chennai had also supported me a lot in these early researches, Srinivasa Desikan, Balasubramaniam, and Gandhi Mati and so on, and the Victor and Albert Museum and British Museum and such like, and other scholars as well, Peter Wemming, Krishnamurti, Prabhakar Sangunmat, and so on. And so thank you all. And with that, I think I will stop the slide share and go back to the, yeah, go back, stop the show there. So thank you, and all the very best. Thank you for this opportunity again.